I'm Carl Van Ness. I'm head of archives and manuscripts here in the Department of Special and Area Studies and Collections. Excuse me. Welcome to the George A. Smathers Libraries. The library is pleased to be both a venue and one of the many co-sponsors for the Rehumanizing the University Speaker Series. I always refer to this building as a perpetual work project. I've been here since 1984, and I don't think there's been a year where there hasn't been at least some kind of renovation, restoration, addition, beautification. The latest addition to the building is our Quiet Study Center, Quiet Study area in the South Corridor down here. If you're a student, you might want to check this out. If you're a faculty member, you might want to tell your students about it. We've also added a number of exhibit cases over the years to show off just a few examples of the many treasures that we have in Smathers Library. Our collections are also a perpetual work project. We are constantly adding new collections and building on existing ones. Smathers Library is home to special collections and some of our most valuable scholarly resources. Included among them are a few of world-class caliber, such as the Baldwin Library of Historical Children's Literature, considered by many to be the most comprehensive library of children's literature in the English language. We're also strong in the areas of American popular culture, Latin American culture and history, more specifically Caribbean, and even more specifically Cuba and Haiti, and of course Florida history and culture. Virtually everything under the Florida sun is represented in special collections. We have environmental collections, political collections, architectural collections. In fact, that's a new area that we're building. We document the social movements of the 1960s, and we have some absolutely wonderful literary manuscript collections, including three of Florida's most prominent writers, Marjorie Canaan Rawlings, John D. MacDonald, and of course, Zora Neale Hurston. We also have in special collections the University Archives, which documents the university's history. And I would like to say a few words in my capacity as a university historian before I relinquish the podium to Bonnie, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Our speaker comes today from Emory University, and the University of Florida and Emory share some history in the person of Andrew Sledd. Andrew Sledd was our first president, and before he came to Florida in 1904, he had been a faculty member at Emory. In 1902, Sledd wrote an article for the Atlantic Monthly entitled "The Negro, Another View" that challenged the racial orthodoxy of the day. In doing so, he made a number of statements that upset the white power structure, but none more so than his assertion that the race problem was a national problem and not a regional one. In other words, the South could not, on its own, solve the race issue. This was a line you simply did not cross in 1902 in the South, and it set off a vitriolic firestorm that eventually led to his resignation. In Florida, he was no less controversial, but not on the issue of race. Here he became embroiled in a struggle over who would govern the state universities. Would it be the university presidents and the Board of Control under Chairman Nathan Bryan? Or would it be the Board of Education, which at that time consisted of the governor, 3 cabinet members, and the superintendent of public instruction? Well, to make a long story short, the Board of Education won, Sledd and Bryan resigned, and 100 years later, we are still fighting the same fight over the issue of governance and who's governing the universities. So we haven't made a lot of progress in that area. We have, however, made some progress in the area of race relations in Florida. UF, like other Southern colleges, has a complicated and controversial history in this regard. Suffice it to say that today's university bears very little resemblance to the institution that grudgingly and under court order admitted its first African-American student in 1958. We no longer play Dixie at football games. The Brothers of Kappa Alpha no longer hold a plantation ball with the Sisters of Tri Delt. This was an annual event in which the members of Kappa Alpha dressed up as Confederate soldiers. They had a cannon. In fact, they would get on horses and Confederate uniforms and go over to the Tri Delt house and then give the sisters the invitations to the ball. Today, on the other hand, we have one of the most diverse student bodies in the nation. So we've come a long way. I could go on all night about this subject, but I'm not. I'm going to leave it at that and let Bonnie introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Bonnie Efros. I'm the Rothman Chair and Director of the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere here at the University of Florida. And it's my great pleasure to see so many of you and to welcome you to the third event of the Rehumanizing the University, New Perspectives on the Liberal Arts series. As many of you know, the Center is at the start of an 18-month-long series on the place of the humanities in higher education. And our aim is to create a forum with many voices with many voices in which the university and community can tackle some of the historical and contemporary tensions in the intellectual life of universities and point to the way that their relationships with the surrounding communities, whether local or global, will develop in the future. Our speakers will confront the consequences and implications of reduced public funding for education, growing ethnic and religious difference on university campuses, the impact of globalization on education, the potentials and pitfalls of information technology on our campuses, and what some refer to as the general trend toward corporatization of higher education. So these talks are meant to catalyze engaged discussion about how these changes affect education. And also what our future as a public land grant institution is. Our speakers will also contemplate and contextualize the hallmarks, aims, artifacts, audiences, and outcomes of a liberal arts education. And the ultimate goal of the series is to provide a critical reading of universities' contributions to academic advances and public life so that we can make sense of the complex issues integral to their future evolution. Many different organizations have made tonight's event possible, and I'd like to just mention them quickly. These include, of course, the Rothman Endowment at the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere, the Harn Eminent Chair in Art History Program, the UF Honors Program, the Alexander Grass Chair in Jewish History at UF, the UF International Center, the UF Office of Research, the UF the UF College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the UF Center for Jewish Studies, the UF Libraries, the UF College of Public Health and Health Professions, the UF France Florida Research Institute, the Hyatt and C.C. Brown Endowment for Florida Archaeology, the UF Department of History, the UF Department of Classics. I'm sorry, it goes on, but people have been very generous. The UF African American Studies Program, the UF Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research, the UF College of Design, Construction, and Planning, and our community partner, the Alachua County Library District. And I also want to thank Sophia Akerd, Cindy Link, and Chris Benora for helping to prepare for this lecture and those that will be following in the coming year and a half. And we've placed flyers out in the lobby if you'd like more information about our series, and we have a sign-up sheet for those who'd like to get emails. Finally, after long months of thinking and organizing, it's always very rewarding to see events like today's come to fruition. And I'm especially pleased to be able to welcome Professor Leslie Harris to Gainesville. Professor Harris, who is the Winship Distinguished Professor in the Humanities at Emory University, earned her PhD in African American History from Stanford University in 1995. With the support of a Mellon Foundation Dissertation Fellowship and a Stanford Humanities Center Graduate Fellowship, she first studied the history of pre-Civil War African Americans in the United States and their struggles to achieve freedom and racial equality. Her prize-winning book was called In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City from 1626 to 1863, and this book combed the archives and archaeological data to measure the impact of slavery in the northern United States and demonstrated how vast numbers of enslaved and later freed blacks labored to create our nation's largest city. This book was awarded the Wesley Logan Prize by the American Historical Association and the Association for the Study of American Life and History. She's also the co-editor of a book entitled Slavery in New York, which accompanied the New York Historical Society's exhibit of the same title in 2005-2006, for which she was also the principal advisor. She's currently working on a similar project with the Telfair Museum's Owen Thomas House of Savannah, Georgia. And in addition to writing an autobiographical work that interweaves her family history with that of the city of New Orleans, Professor Harris is also busy on a new project that examines gender and particularly the role of manhood in Southern slavery. At Emory University, Professor Harris has been an active contributor to life on campus. Besides serving as the chair of African American Studies from 2004 to 2006 and in 2007 and 8, Professor Harris co-founded the Transforming Community Project in 2004, which we'll be talking about today. Funded by the Ford Foundation's Difficult Dialogue Initiative and the Office of the President of Emory University, the Transforming Community Project was directed by Professor Harris until this year, and it seeks to mobilize individuals in every sector of Emory University in a reflective, fact-driven engagement with the university's history and current experiences of race, gender, sexuality, and other forms of human differences. Since 2009, Professor Harris is also co-principal investigator of the New Orleans After Katrina project at Emory University, which allows students, scholars, and the general public to build collaboratively the history of New Orleans through their own experiences. So thus, without further ado, I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Professor Leslie Harris, who will be speaking tonight on using diverse histories to transform university communities.
Hi, good evening. I've had such a great visit here. It's been wonderful. I've been meeting so many people who are interested in this kind of work on a number of different levels. You have a fabulous, energizing community. So it's a real thrill to be here tonight to talk to you about what we've been doing down at Emory. I want to just take a moment to thank Bonnie and Sophia for setting up a fabulous schedule for me and all their work in getting me there. We started talking about this in March or February of last year, and so we've been planning it for a long time. I had a great time at the Milhouse Library yesterday talking about my Katrina project, which is really close to my heart. I had an amazing morning at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Project with the students there and with the person whose name I'm forgetting, who I love dearly.
Paul Ortiz.
Thank you. I want to say his name out loud. Paul Ortiz. A senior moment, middle-aged moment with Paul Ortiz and the fabulous, wonderful work that's being done there in terms of oral history. I have to thank Carl Van Ness, your university archivist, for lifting up Andrew Sled right before I talk, who is also someone that has been of much fascination to the Emory community. I'm going to talk about him a little bit more in a while. And thank you to all the faculty and staff and you tonight who turned out to talk with me. So I'm going to talk about this Transforming Community Project. You have a homepage for our website today. I'm going to talk about Emory. And I'm going to talk about why we ended up doing this, some of the real pressures that led me and a fairly large group by the end to form this project, the Transforming Community Project. And then I'll end with where it stands today and what we decided to do. It was originally a 5-year project. I wanted a project with a start date and an end date. And I want to talk about what that means as well for institutions. What happens when an institution is pushed forcefully to confront the ideas of racial diversity, to confront the meaning that diversity holds for its present and future goals as a leader among its peers nationally, as well as in its local community? What happens when the experiment in racial diversity explodes? These are the questions and experiences that Emory University faced in the academic year 2003 to 2004, questions that led me and a group of colleagues there to the establishment of the Transforming Community Project. A series of events in that year, events which will sound familiar to anyone working in academia today, catalyzed a group of us into a period of experimentation to try something different. We were fortunate that we had a new administration that was willing to experiment with us and give us some spending money. And we had a community that in general wanted to do better on issues of diversity, wanted to move beyond just counting numbers and to really figure out what it meant to live in a diverse community. So with all of that support, we created an innovative program, and more importantly than that, a cross-section ultimately of leadership and participation from around the university, although most strongly located at Emory College, which is the undergraduate liberal arts, one of 2 undergraduate liberal arts programs at the university. Oxford College is the site of the original Emory University. It's a 2-year undergraduate college, and they also were very strong partners with us. And knowing the history of that campus was central to the work we did as well. Over the course of 7 years, the TCP, as it came to be known, and it became a verb for some people, so people would say, you need to TCP that problem, so which was an interesting moment for us. The Transforming Community Project, or TCP, provided a space of exploration and then increasing strength for those in the messy middle who wanted to do the right thing on issues of racial diversity, but felt unable to figure out how that fit into their university roles. This was particularly true of staff members, who comprised our largest group of participants in numbers disproportionate to their numbers in the university. But faculty, students, and even some alumni participated over the first 5 years or so of the project. One of the things I'm most proud about with the Transforming Community Project is that it did enable me to use the tools of academia to address some of the most pressing problems of the day, people's lives. Specifically, we used the historical record to ground discussions about racial diversity that enabled a cross-section of the university to develop new skills about how to talk to each other about difficult events. Doing this work enabled me to think more deeply and more clearly about what is meaningful in a liberal arts education, why that's so important to us today. The skills of critical thinking, of respectful questioning, of dialogue on the path to learning more, all hopefully leading to reflective action, to thoughtful action. And we try to model that, and we try to provide people a space to have that experience. I was lucky to be able to transform what is important to me in a liberal arts education into a program for a variety of people with a wide range of academic experience. Again, these were not just faculty or students. Together we learned some history, and some of us even wrote new histories. We learned and shared some ideas about race and racism, and we committed to developing practical skills for living in our diverse society. And not just racial diversity, but political diversity, economic diversity, cultural diversity, that the skills that we talked about in terms of racial issues were skills that are, of course, transferable to other kinds of diversity. I think that we increased the level of tolerance that people had for difficult conversations. We also increased the numbers of people who felt that they could become leaders in their work units on difficult issues. So what happened in 2003, 2004? Okay. This is a story I've told a number of times, and it's not shocking to me anymore, but, again, it's probably familiar to those of you in academia. That year at Emory, that academic year, was a year that I often describe as the year we went from 6 niggers in a woodpile in the fall to Irish anti-Semitism in the spring. It was one of my most difficult years at Emory. By the spring, I was dreading opening my email or returning to campus because there was always some new event, small or large, that was going to occur. The turmoil began during a fall anniversary celebration in the anthropology department, in which a white female distinguished chair professor used the phrase, quote, 6 niggers in a woodpile, to define how she and 5 of her colleagues had felt as members of the department at its founding. And there's a split in that department between physical anthropology and cultural anthropology. I think she's a physical anthropologist, so she was describing how they felt. Following that remark, a black female assistant professor attending the celebration filed a complaint with the Office of Equal Opportunity Programs, not only because of that incident, that phrase, but because of several other instances of inequity that she had experienced during her time in the department. One example, for example, unequal lab space, that it took a very long time for her to get her workspace set up as compared to someone who was hired at the same time. This did not receive any public notice until about a month later, when news of the department incident began to filter around the campus. It was a public forum at which this happened. Once that news filtered around the campus, there was a big outcry, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, some of the responses to that. There was a big outcry, particularly among the students, graduate students and then undergraduates, who felt particularly betrayed by this sort of public, the use of that epithet in public. Then several other incidents occurred, some that got a lot of attention in the press and others that did not. And these all raised further concern about Emory's racial climate. 2 non-Emory students attended a campus Halloween party dressed in blackface, but any other year it could have been 2 Emory students as a kind of regular occurrence, I think, on a lot of college campuses. In the spring, an invitation to former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Mary Robinson to speak at the 2004 Emory commencement sparked campus unrest and accusations of anti-Semitism based on Robinson's involvement in the 2001 UN International Conference Against Racism, and I won't list all of the title of that had been held in Durban, South Africa. And some of you may know that that conference fell apart. It continues to be on rocky ground because of conflict between pro-Israel and pro-Palestine factions there. Strife about the campus racial climate was fomented further when conservative speaker David Horowitz was invited to speak about the Robinson incident and to comment more generally on race and political correctness. These headline-producing events had counterpoints in a number of incidents that didn't make the papers, but that did circulate among the relatively small Emory community, Emory College community. And I won't detail those here, but suffice to say, those smaller events among students, among faculty, between faculty and staff, as well as these headline events, and when I say headlines, I mean in Atlanta as well. The AJC did a story on the anthropology department incident and what was happening on campus. So around Atlanta as well, people were talking and debating what's going on at Emory, what's happening. These all generated a feeling of unease and mistrust on campus that felt, for many of us, very unusual. Not that there hadn't been other moments of tension, but so many things in 1 year really ratcheted up the stress. The tension did prompt action in several quarters throughout the Emory campus. Following the fall faculty incident, a university-wide town hall meeting was convened by the newly appointed Emory president, James Wagner, and it revealed deep differences in the Emory community concerning the responsibility of the university to address such incidents. A multiracial coalition of undergraduate and graduate students called for some form of diversity training for the university community as a whole. Although a few faculty agreed with this approach, several faculty members at the town hall vociferously spoke against any kind of diversity training for faculty members. At an Emory College faculty meeting convened later that semester, another group of faculty presented a motion that Emory University's discriminatory harassment policy be revised to remove its regulations against discriminatory speech because the regulations limited academic freedom. And again, this is a conversation that comes up with some regularity. The initiative did not pass in that meeting or a later meeting, but as one faculty member stated, more than an up or down vote on issues of diversity was needed. Over the course of that year, 5 university-sanctioned public dialogues on race, diversity, and community at Emory were held, involving more than 200 members of the faculty and staff who would meet and talk and were actually tape recorded and allowed themselves to be tape recorded to share their views on what their experience of race had been like at Emory. And those are still on file in the archives and were available on reserve at the library for a period of time after they were completed. These conversations, which were mostly attended by staff members, and I don't think any students were present, it was really for staff, revealed even more tension and hostility that staff members, who were predominantly non-white, felt on campus. It was a very different sense of the university than most faculty members had, and it was very eye-opening for many of us as faculty. I think even for those of us who were minority faculty. The Emory General Council, in consultation with a wide range of Emory faculty from all sides of the academic freedom debate, did revise the discriminatory harassment laws, but more so to bring them into current alignment with national law, which it seemed we were a little behind on, and then to address Emory's own best practices and goals. In that process, Emory College faculty learned that that discriminatory harassment policy had implications not just for faculty and students, but also for the large numbers of staff who worked at Emory. And it was a key element of their legal protections, and that's not only an issue of faculty or student issues, although faculty and students generally garnered the most attention. As all of that was happening, the new president, James Wagner, who had been on the job approximately 2 months when the professor's remark occurred, led the development of the first ever Emory vision statement, included in which is a very clear statement about Emory's commitment to diversity. And a large proportion, he had a sort of, it wasn't a blog, because I don't think we have blogs quite yet, but it was, you could sign in and put your ideas about what should be in the Emory vision statement. And a large proportion of those who participated in that took great pride in their sense of Emory as a diverse place and wanted diversity to be explicitly named in that vision statement. And in a related action, Provost Earl Lewis, who began at Emory almost a year after all of this happened in July 2004, Earl Lewis approved creation of a new senior administrative position at the rank of vice provost. devoted exclusively to promoting and ensuring, it's called diversity and community on campus. Provost Lewis, as some of you may know, is the first provost of African descent at Emory, and at the time of his appointment was one of only 2 African American provosts at predominantly white institutions. So there was a lot of policy actions and implications that grew out of that year, and that was, of course, important. But a group of us, faculty, staff, and students, began to believe that actions like these, while constructive, could not alone address the issues of community that had been exposed during that year, or guarantee functional interactions among community members. To be sure, the university's responses helped to clarify some of the misunderstandings and relieve some tensions of that year. But the events and the responses also revealed a persistent problem that we felt required longer-term attention and new approaches. In the wake of the anthropology incident, Black faculty had written a letter declaiming what had happened. And so 2 white faculty members, the 2 actually who said we don't want any faculty diversity training, contacted all of the signatories to that letter and invited them to a meeting. They had never been leaders on campus in racial issues as far as I know. And that meeting that they called with the Black faculty signatories and with a few other people that they knew evolved into a year-long series of meetings, discussions, and debates about what the situation was at Emory around diversity. We began to ask each other a number of questions, which can be boiled down to 2 or 3 big ones. Were the events of this year exceptional or routine? Were they indicative of a unique set of personalities and circumstances, or were they indicative of a deeply racist environment? As we began to try to answer that first question, we realized that people in different parts of the university had very different answers to that question depending not only on racial identity, but almost more important in terms of their location in the hierarchy of the university. So a second question emerged naturally out of that one. What is the history and current experience of race at Emory? As my colleagues, those 2 colleagues were both social sciences, so that year I was like, what's the data? Where's the data? Anyway, we managed to deal with that question a little bit. But behind the data question, how do we track and understand what's happening and what has happened at Emory? How do we put this in a context? And the third question I think that emerged was ultimately, what is our capacity at Emory to address racial difference? Although there were and are critical mass of scholars at Emory who study race, and as I learned, a number of staff, faculty, and students who had experience in addressing racial issues in communities, they had done things like the National Coalition Building Institute and other kinds of racial justice work. Many at Emory still felt ill-equipped in their daily lives there to discuss how racial differences affected them, to discuss that openly and honestly. They felt ill-informed on the history of race relations, not only at Emory, but also in the nation. And most importantly, they felt they did not have constructive ways to address either exceptional circumstances, such as the remarks by professors, or periodic occurrences on college campuses, and additionally, any discussions about race that occurred on campus, they felt, only occurred in the wake of troubling incidents such as the ones described. And that's probably the worst time to try to reach a consensus on the long-term meaning of diversity in a community. Beyond these moments, these racial incidents, there was not a clear sense of what our goals as a community were around racial diversity. Emory always ends up at or near the top of university in terms of the numbers, in terms of the diversity of its faculty, and it's comparable to its peers in terms of the diversity of its student body. But is such diversity by the numbers meaningful alone? And we felt the lesson of that year was that that's not enough. You can't just put everyone all together and think it's going to be okay. Should diversity actually impact the culture of the university? Should it impact what questions we ask in a deeper way intellectually? Should it shape the work that we do with our students? The Transforming Community Project grew out of these questions and concerns, and it developed into 2 major emphases to try to address these issues. One were community dialogues, in which small groups of faculty, staff, students, and even alums would meet to discuss the history and current experiences of racial issues in the nation as a whole, and then how those were reflected at the very local level on the Emory campus. And they would do that through a set syllabus of readings and films. The second major emphasis was the creation of a common record in which we encouraged members, anyone in the Emory community who wanted to try to uncover an element of Emory's racial history and current experience. And I'll just briefly describe that. To that end, we had the help of people like your university archivist. Our university archivists were behind this project. They were willing to hold workshops for individuals. Again, many of the people who got involved in that piece of it, creating a common record, were staff members who had very little experience with the kind of historical research that I do, but we were committed to sharing ideas and sharing the knowledge of what it takes to write history, and of opening up the archives. And so that was a very powerful thing for a much smaller group of people who really wanted to ask and answer their own questions about Emory's racial history. These two pieces of the Transforming Community Project were intimately interrelated. Our goal was to increase knowledge about the diverse community and its complex history at Emory, and to increase the skills that we felt necessary to be a part of a diverse community. I will say, too, that a third important goal for me was to increase understanding of academic work and to elevate the importance of that work to these discussions. I wanted academic work to be an important tool in discussions around these kinds of issues. And I'm not necessarily talking about elaborate theories, but even just basic history, some of the basic stories, just knowledge. I think so often discussions of race and diversity get reduced only to personal experience or alleged lack of personal experience. And by alleged lack, on the one hand, individualized experiences of racism, which then don't get contextualized in a larger history. They don't have any context. And then it's easy to discount them. Well, that just happened to you. Must have been a bad day. That's something between two individuals. There isn't a sense of how those individual things can become part of a pattern. The second thing that happens is the idea that I'm not a racist, or my ancestors didn't own slaves, therefore this is not my issue or problem to solve. And I'm speaking about that in terms of the black-white dynamic, but there are a number of diverse dynamics in which that could happen. We could say the same, create similar kinds of phrases in relationship to the immigration discussions we're having these days. We sought to help people begin to understand how institutional frameworks and practices that remained unexamined could reinforce undesirable outcomes. And that sounds really administrative talk, but sometimes you got to talk like an administrator. We tried to reinforce the idea that the work of being part of a diverse community is actually work. It's not only about how I feel or how you feel, that there's work to be done. Just as being part of a work team is part of your job, or being part of an academic department, that there are some skills that you should have, or being part of a classroom community for a semester. There are some ways that you should think about how you want to be part of that community. But that's all part of the work, and so we can have a similar kind of discussion about what it means to be doing the work of being part of a diverse community. By understanding these actions as part of the work that was central to the mission of the university, we hope that we would also make the work of diversity more accessible to a broader range of people. We sought to take some of the fear out of talking about racial diversity, moving instead to acknowledge that everyone has work to do. No one holds all the answers, and anyone can move and improve. And that, for me, was very important to break down this idea that the ownership of all the definitions of what race means and what racism is only owned by minorities. Because if that's by racial minorities, because if that's true, then it also means that only we get to do the work in some real way. And that was sort of one of my personal aims. And so as we built the Transforming Community Project, it was always very important to have blacks and whites and other groups. It was never something that was done by all African Americans. When we did our peer facilitator groups, there were always two, and we always tried to have them of different races, different genders, different status at the university. And that was really important to model that this is work that's done across those lines. It's not owned by only the faculty. It's not only the faculty who can own knowledge, or it's not only black people who can understand ideas about race, but everyone has to learn and can learn. In reinforcing the TCP as important to the university, we had a couple of things on our side. One was a very different financial picture than we now live in. And the second was the leadership support of the upper level of the administration, the president and provost. Both our president and provost were very strong supporters of our work. And I won't go into all the details about that, but that helped, but it didn't make everything go smoothly. But it helped at some high level to know that in a big way we were in alignment with their vision for the university. Although as in any university, there are some people who never care about what's going on at that level, so it didn't change everything. I'm going to talk a little bit now about what we actually did. I'm going to start with the name that we came up with. The name Transforming Community Project itself comes from the recognition that all communities are constantly evolving. University communities in particular, as you know, see an extraordinary amount of change. Students come and go, faculty stay longer than students, but every department has had that experience of having a key faculty member leave or set of people leave, and the whole way the department ran in one way has to change and run in another. So do non-academic departments experience change as long-term staff members leave and new staff members come in with new ideas. These kinds of changes are accepted, even though they may be difficult, as part of the natural pattern of university life. But the populations of many universities have changed dramatically in other ways in the last 50 to 60 years. Colleges and universities, as our university archivist has just mentioned, have shifted from being exclusive, often racially and sexually homogenous institutions designed to reinforce students' middle-class or upper-class mores, to being racially and sexually diverse institutions, from which students graduate with a much wider variety of goals. The diversity of students is mirrored by faculty, although to a lesser extent, and by staff. These more recent changes provide an opportunity for an institution to reconsider its guiding principles, both how the institution has changed and how individuals within these institutions can actively address the challenges and opportunities that increased diversity introduces. So this title, Transforming Community Project, recognizes that all communities are in a state of transformation, but also that the transformation of communities is a project, and it is one that we can be actively engaged in. I used to say all the time, you can be whipped by change if you want to be, or you can try to be an active participant in change, in a small or larger way. Initial planning for the Transforming Community Project took place over a 2-year period in which nearly 200 faculty, students, and staff weighed in on the shape of the project. The syllabus that we used was created through a group effort over the summer, and I'll just take a minute to pull it up so you can find it. I used to be a Dell person, but now I'm a Mac person. So, minimize? No, I want
The middle one.
What?
I think that it's the middle one. There are 3 panels, the middle panel. You go down again. Okay. The middle panel.
Yeah, I'm trying to open this.
This one is already.
No, I want to open this one.
This one is
Oh, I
already.
see. No, that's not the right. I apologize. It should already be up. Thank you. Okay, here's our sample community dialogue syllabus. So this syllabus was created through a group effort. We later revised it. Syllabus was created through a group effort over the summer involving staff, faculty, and students, and the first community dialogues began in fall 2005. Each dialogue held about 15 people, optimally, who committed to meeting over a meal for 7 to 8 sessions. As best we could, we created groups that included staff, faculty, students, and alums that were racially and gender mixed and were led by facilitator peers who also crossed lines of status, race, and gender. For example, our facilitators might be a student and a staff person, or a faculty person and a staff person, a younger person and an older person also. In the first 2 years of the project, nearly 700 community members participated in a dialogue. And since 2005 to about now, we've had close to 2,000 members of the Emory community participate in our community dialogue program. And many, if not more, attended various events we sponsored throughout the year. We did a lot of public programming, often in partnership. It was very important, I think, for Bonnie to name all those partners, because that's the way that you really get involved in it. We did the same kind of thing, either on a smaller scale, but for some of our bigger programs, we also had large numbers of partners because we wanted people to feel that they had ownership in what we were doing, that it wasn't just us in a room somewhere making up things. According to a 2009 study we did of who was participating in these dialogues, in terms of racial breakdown, our participants were 41% white, 34% black, 7% unknown, 2% Hispanic, and then 12% mixed race or other. I'm not sure how that category got in there because we had other categories. In terms of who in the university participated, we were 15% faculty administrators, which is almost at the exact percentage of their representation in the university. 43% students and alums, and then 42% staff. One interesting thing that we think about or thought about all the time was that overwhelmingly our participants were women. 78% women to 20% men. And we talked about it a lot. We tried a lot of different things to change that ratio, and we never were successful. So the first syllabus we created combined some standards of Emory history, as well as trying to provide historical context to some of the more recent issues that had created tension on campus. As is probably true of many universities, and not only those in the South, Emory's existence is rooted in some of the most difficult times in this nation's racial history. It was founded amid slavery in 1836 as a jewel of the cotton enslaved South, dedicated to upholding the slave system and creating leaders for that system. It remained a segregated, predominantly white and male institution throughout much of the 20th century. But even that history of race is a little bit more complicated than might appear initially. It's probably not surprising to you that African Americans were employed by the institution from its founding, first by slaves and then as wage laborers. In the early 20th century, Emory College admitted Jews, more than one, when many elite northern universities practiced Jewish exclusion, and that was an important part of the Emory culture, being in Atlanta as well. Further, the university's School of Theology, the Candler School of Theology, developed missionary activities in Asia and Latin America, and thus there were students from Korea, from Japan, and China at Emory from the late 19th century through to the present. Emory also set up relationships with institutions in Cuba and other parts of Latin America. I think we should see if there's some records here about any of that. In 1902, further complicating the history of race at Emory a little bit, was our friend Andrew Sled, our common intellectual ancestor, who was a Latin professor at the time, who published an article in the Atlantic Monthly critical of the lynching of African Americans, a practice, as many of you know, that was widespread in the South at the time. The article led to protests against the university and against Sled, who resigned his teaching position in the aftermath, although and came here, and then he left here and went back to Emory, was rehired at Emory. Similarly, the successes of desegregation, amid which the university now exists, are not without complication. Emory was the first private higher education institution in Georgia to admit black students, and it successfully sued the state for this privilege in 1962. But it didn't do so because out of altruism or out of a great desire to be diverse. Rather, this was the beginning of the moment when Emory was trying to achieve national status, and it knew that it would lose out on federal funds if it did not integrate. So that, as much as anything, was the reason for the lawsuit to admit African American students. Since then, the school has attracted an incredibly diverse population, as I already mentioned, among its staff, faculty, and students, and it often ends up near the top ranking in terms of the number of black faculty there. As Emory has become more successful in attracting and retaining a diverse population of faculty, students, and staff, the impetus to ignore a more troubling racial past in hopes that its influence will crumble on its own is compelling. But current day diversity, of course, brings with it its own growing pains and difficulties that are part of the price of that success and are partially rooted in Emory's past, but are also very much part of the present. And I've, again, already described some of those things from that year. And the other things that people mentioned in the course of that year, as people began to open up more, was the concern with, for example, academic departments that were virtually all white. Tension between faculty and staff, where staff felt very much that faculty were playing on their own sense of hierarchy and dumping, quote unquote, dumping on the staff. When one moves up the institutional chain of command at Emory, as in many historically white institutions, the upper levels of administration are predominantly white and male, and that also came in for a lot of criticism during that time. In the face of important daily questions about the here and now, it may seem problematic or even avoidant to use history as the basis for our discussions. But of course, some of these issues do have, that seem current, in fact, have deeper historical notes. And we also found that using history was a way to build community in these smaller groups on topics that were less charged. And then through those topics, by the time we got to the things that were more charged, people had built up enough trust that they could then begin to unpack some of their more difficult and pressing questions. For example, one example, a foundational Emory story is that of the enslaved woman Kitty, or Catherine Boyd, owned by Bishop James Andrew, who was the first president of Emory's Board of Trustees. The Methodist Church nationally split into northern and southern factions over the ownership of Kitty. And in the town of Oxford, Georgia, which is the original site of Emory, that story still reverberates in that community, which continues to be segregated black and white during this time. People debate the nature of the relationship between the bishop and Kitty, whether or not there was a sexual relationship. She had a special cottage known as Kitty's Cottage that the bishop built for her, which for many African Americans is a sign of a problem. It's not something nice, but for many whites it's a sign of the benevolence of slavery. So using that story, which is a foundational Emory story, as the first point of discussion, on the one hand got people into some pretty deep water quickly. On the other hand, it was a story historically far back enough in time that people could have discussion and debate about it fairly easily. I mean, it still is a difficult story, but it was a good one to start with. By the time dialogue groups got to the discussion of the use of the word nigger, which is the thing that had sparked our work in the beginning, in the second half of the series of meetings, in most cases enough trust had been built up that more deeper discussions began to emerge, and more fine-grained discussions as well. Groups used selections from Randall Kennedy's book, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word, and then discussed the very incident I described that had been the catalyst for the TCP. One of the most important things that participants began to learn through that discussion was about the diversity of opinion and experience within racial groups, which often is not apparent in the midst of a crisis generated by an inflammatory incident. Often whites still assume that all African Americans hold the same opinions on racial issues, and similarly African Americans and other minority group members may remain unaware of the capacity that some whites have developed to deal with racial issues. So in this case, with this word, those things come into play in interesting ways and deepen people's knowledge of each other in those situations. And in addition, generational differences between African Americans in the use of that word also emerged as just one example in which participants really felt that they got to deepen their understanding of the community around them. A critical piece for these dialogues, I just want to mention, and then I'm going to show you a clip quickly that gives you a sense of what the dialogues meant to people, were our peer facilitators. These peer facilitators, over the course of the project, we trained approximately 80 peer facilitators. These individuals became an important part of a leadership community across the university. After the first couple of years, at times, we were able to offer these peer facilitators to other units in specific situations where they could use specific tactics and materials from our community dialogues to help other units resolve issues in the workplace. Additionally, we also began to do programs outside of Emory in Atlanta and brought our skills and our facilitators along on those projects as well. The other thing that our peer facilitators helped us do that became very important was to expand into other topics. Since our first couple of years discussing race, we expanded, we developed community dialogue curricula on gender, Middle East conflict, sexuality, and we now have a dialogue in development on disability in the university. We also developed dialogues for specific groups. One dialogue was developed for campus services, which is one of our biggest work units. It includes facilities management, the police department, architects, all of that group. That had a lot of conflict over, in terms of class difference and hierarchical difference. So with that group, we emphasized the issues of race, but also issues of class much more than we had in our other dialogue group. So I want to take a moment and share with you a short video that gives you a sense of what the importance of the experience and the dialogue was for 3 people. This first a staff member, then a faculty member, and then a student.
My story about TCP is that I lived in Covington until I was around 10, and I never knew that Oxford College was just right across the railroad track. I just say, wow, that was so amazing that I lived there all those years and I never knew about Oxford College. I cried. I actually broke down into tears, and I'll just never forget that day and that moment. TCP helps me to understand, help me to process it, get through it, and understand probably the possibilities as to why it was never brought up in my family during my childhood. As you go through the class, I took it for 8 weeks, and by the end of 8 weeks, I was a cheerleader. I met some outstanding and some remarkable people of all different races that worked at Emory. You must attend the TCP classes. It will change your life forever.
On September 15th of 2007, my children and I were attacked in a parking lot. And there were some real difficult repercussions to that, and it actually was good that I had had the Transforming Community Project session the summer before, because there were a lot of difficult questions that were happening in our family, and I was better able to address some of them. The man who did attack us happened to be black, so my son was hiding behind my legs every time he saw a black man after that, and I didn't know how to deal with that either. One thing that Transforming Community Project did for me was allow me to have difficult conversations in a way that I had never had them before. And I started to write down conversations on race and ethnicity, violence, healing, that type of thing. And I've written a whole book. So The Little Girl Is Me is a book about finding your voice. I thought it initially was about discussions on race and ethnicity. But as the process unfolded, I realized it was about a lot more. Seeing people talk about race and ethnicity, the difficulties that they've had and that they've worked through, really gave me the courage to look into my own past and my own difficulties and talk about it in a very transformative, healing way.
The summer of my sophomore year, I was actively looking for a research project to do. I couldn't find anybody to work with me, like a faculty member or thing like that, but Dr. Usher reached out to me when I emailed Dean Brzezinski about really wanting to do a project of some kind, and I networked with Dr. Usher, and we came upon this interesting idea to take the focus of the Transforming Community Project, which I had never heard of at the time, outside of the realm of African-American Caucasian race relations. I was very so-called Americanized, and coming here was very interesting for me in my freshman year because I wasn't embraced by a Korean community of any kind. I couldn't speak the language at the time, and I felt there was a distance between Korean American groups and Korean International student groups. But this transformative element came when I began to realize my unique place as a student of race at Emory University, specifically with regards to my Korean background. One thing Dr. Usher said that was so almost prophetic is she said when I was meeting for her to even become part of TCP that summer, she said, I would hope that this experience is something that will define your summer, but also define your undergraduate career. I hope you would leave changed. And I knew that would happen that summer, but I cannot express how much it's impacted my life, even to this day.
At the time of our 5-year experiment, people would often ask, why only 5 years? Why isn't this project going to go on forever? Well, I'm a firm believer in an endpoint for many things. We all know university projects are activities that continue far past their usefulness. In addition, I wanted there to be some urgency to the project. I wanted people to know that you had a finite time that you could participate, hopefully long enough that you could clear your calendar a little bit. You have a couple of years to think about it, but know that it needs to happen now. It needed to have as much urgency as the events that inspired it. At the same time, and I should say that I selfishly myself did not want to be tied to the TCP forever, although I knew eventually that there might be others who might want to take it over. In the end, the Transforming Community Project has been grown and sustained by those other people who have taken parts of it and transformed it and taken it into other parts of the institution. When we began, our Equal Opportunity Programs Office was reactive, but when that new Office of Diversity and Community got established, they brought in new leadership and they adopted our community dialogues as their signature program. And so the community dialogues live on in that office now. And it's a signature program of that office. We also have a number of projects that we completed during the 5 years. And this is one that will continue, that are part of the permanent mark of the university, a record of the university. Everything that we did, we videotaped. All of the major events, we often invited people from Emory's history. But this was a major thing that we did with Dawood Bey, who's an internationally known photographer, who came and did what he called the Emory Project, where he took paired photographs, often crossing racial, ethnic status lines in our community. He had people write and say who they were, but then tried to shape them if they were being a little bit too generic. So this is our president, James Wagner, with Carlton Mackey, who works in the Ethics Center. And I want to show you, get back to it, a particularly beautiful, this became, we have a very large, strong connection with Tibet and the Draken Losling Monastery. So this is one of our signature images of the Emory community as it stands. Very strong African-American heritage that's part of the Emory community, but also this Tibetan connection, which probably many people don't think of in connection with Atlanta, but which the Dalai Lama actually wanted specifically Atlanta to be a site for worship in North America. So we try to think of things that would continue to reverberate throughout the community, even if the Transforming Community Project went its own way. The final thing that we did in a more traditional academic mode was a conference that some of you may know of that we held in February 2011. It was really a two-part conference. One part, at the request of the Ford Foundation, who were one of our major funders, was a replication conference for 25 to 30 other institutions of higher education who sent representatives and who we spent a day with talking about the Transforming Community Project and the work we had done, and getting there, offering our services to them really if they wanted to develop similar kinds of programs on their campuses. When we followed that one-day workshop with an international conference on slavery in the university, histories and legacies, and we had scholars from across North America, but also from the Caribbean and from Europe, who came and talked about the history of slavery in various higher education institutions, and we're working on an edited volume that's going to come out of that. What does all of this mean in the end? One of the fears that institutions often have of discussing such difficult histories is that someone, usually alums, will become offended by what's being talked about, will want to hide these histories and cover them up. Indeed, during the series of events around the Department of Anthropology, as many of us asked for greater transparency about the university's record, about the institution's goals, some feared the impact of that exposure. Not so much those at the very top, as it turned out, not our president and provost, but rather more people in the middle and faculty. There was a concern that talking about all of this would bring greater anger and alienation. But in fact, talking about it ended up bringing deeper respect for the institution. Many who went through the experience, I think, felt, as this focus group participant did, she said, total exposure of Emory's dirty little secrets. I was surprised that they wanted me to go and hear about it, to own up to it. That is true leadership. The idea that an institution would engage in reflective self-examination was powerful, and the practice of it was powerful too. But as importantly for me personally is the recognition that the academic work that I'm passionate about is something that those outside of traditional academia are passionate about too, particularly at this moment when the work of universities, and particularly the liberal arts and humanities, is under attack. It is all the more important that we remain clear and creative in our understanding of why this work is important to the whole world around us. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think we do have some time for questions, if anybody has any.
Just going to take you all the way back to the beginning.
Sure.
One, just a historical sort of curiosity question. Really? I don't think so. The phrase you began with that started all the trouble, since I don't want to go Google that in my office computer, can you, the only place I ever encountered it was an Agatha Christie novel.
Oh, really?
It's in
The 10 little, no, it's
It's
10
probably-
little
no,
Indians.
it's in-
It's in, okay, well anyway.
But what does
I know.
it mean?
Funny that you ask, because a lot of people go, oh my gosh, you said what? And I go, what does that mean? This, apparently, a lot of us were Googling afterwards, so our computers are already infected. This, apparently during the Civil War, appropriately enough, since it was a phrase used in a political cartoon. I'm not going to remember the exact thing, but there's a picture of Lincoln, a drawing of Lincoln, and he's on a woodpile, because you know there was always about the chopping wood thing. And out of a woodpile, a Negro, as he would probably have said, but as they said, a nigger left. And it was this idea that the Civil War, he may have thought he was just chopping wood, he may have thought he was just saving the Union, but the slavery issue. But it was the nigger in the woodpile. So that, but, a lot of people were like, we've never heard, a lot of people go, she used that word? And it was like, what does she mean? Like it was an odd moment on all. How did she
and then if I could ask you about her.
Yeah.
What happened to her, and did she participate in this, or what was her fate?
Yeah, that's a good question. Her and also the young assistant professor. So she was actually understandably quite horrified by what occurred because the whole campus was in an uproar. I think she went on leave. The dean gave her a leave, which of course for a faculty person is a very complicated punishment. It wasn't meant to be a punishment.
Paid leave?
Oh yeah, it wasn't an unpaid leave. She was on leave for I think the next semester. So yeah. The charges that were brought to EOP were not seen as significant. The EOP office did not rule in favor of the assistant professor. And there was a very subtle, but basically you have no case about any of the things that you brought up. That assistant professor eventually left the anthropology department and then left Emory. And very quiet, it was a real failure. So the faculty member is back. I actually, coincidentally, served on an honors committee with her this past spring with a wonderful student. I was the chair of the committee. She knows that I did this work. I actually went to a meeting of the anthropology department and presented the Transforming Community Project formally to them because they knew that it was happening and I wanted to invite them to participate. Someone else from that department did participate but then went off in a huff. That department has many problems, and this incident was only one of them, I'll say. But she's fine. She's working at the university. She looked fine when I saw her. We didn't talk about this. But the assistant professor was lost, is how I would put it.
How old is the woman who said the thing? Is it a generational thing by this point, or is that just an impossible defense to make these days?
I don't think, how old would you have to be?
Right, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a Civil War reference. It's a reference used in 1860-something. So I don't know what age you would have to be to make it still okay.
Right.
So,
Okay.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I think.
Well, the title of the project is Transforming Community Project.
Mm-hmm.
As somebody who's worked for non-governmental organizations, it's very nice to read reports of things that have happened. Now, what are the markers that if anybody got to Emory today will tell us that there has been a beyond form, which is the word transform? What are the parameters, what are the signs that we can now see that there has been a change? Institutionally, you talk about the leadership showing interest, but beyond the interest of the individuals within the institution, what within Emory institutionally would convince me or show me that there has been a movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Tonight, I'm not sure. Some days I can say, I will say, so one of the shortcomings, one thing that I would say is the improvement of the EOP, the Equal Opportunity Programs Office. That office, which is the place where not only the arts and sciences, but we have this huge health sciences. Everyone has to go to that office to get assistance if they want to do that work. And that's the main place to go. That office has definitely been transformed by our work and by the project itself, and that's where the project, in a sense, lives on a day-to-day basis. Beyond that, to be honest, I will say that the change that you would see would depend very much on where you landed. I think that and that it is incremental, it's small. It is not something that I would see that's massive. And that's, when I meet with the people who participated in it, they feel that they can address issues that come up. But one of the shortcomings of it is that it came out of this dramatic moment. And so I do feel that we haven't had those same kinds of really dramatic incidents and that people really, that there is a greater resource to address them. Like there was a blackface incident a couple of years ago, but there was a group of people who were like, let's go talk to the students in this way. Let's show this video and have this conversation. That there was a response to it that was not, that was constructive and that used it as a teaching moment, I think, in the best ways that universities can do. So I feel like that there's a group of people who are mobilized around those kinds of things. I think the other piece that you're getting at is this institutional change and a kind of culture change and a definition and a redefinition of what these things mean, like I said, beyond just the numbers. And that, I realized, is the harder thing to do. And I feel like we've now created a group of people who are a little bit more ready to do that kind of work, but that's another project and not necessarily this project. So I feel like it did a lot for what it did. It opened a lot of people. Like I said, it provided this sense of leadership, of greater leadership. And not all leadership is up here. A lot of it needs to be at ground level. At the same time, I'm ready to see something that's much more direct. That's some conversations that are not about history, actually, but that are really about very concrete definitions. So we have this nice vision statement. Are we really wedded? I'll give you one example. There's a faculty diversity fund for diversity and excellence. So you can apply to that fund to hire special faculty members. I would guarantee you that almost no one has made an argument on the diversity. I want to hire this person to improve the diversity of my department, because that is also a marker of excellence. Diversity and excellence in our institutions are still seen this way. And so my next conversation is, how do we begin to see them as the same, as common goals, and that a goal of diversity does not take away from excellence, but actually might lead us to eminence. This is, all of these conversations about even the striver universities that are never going to be Ivy League, but yet don't quite, we have it in our mission statement, courageous inquiry, blah, 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 but we haven't quite gotten there. So I feel like we've tilled some soil, but we're still trying to get some seeds to grow.
Just finally, have you ever come across a video called The Divided Class? Mm-hmm. One in which third graders were shown what it means to feel segregation.
Yeah.
Well, and then years after, like I think 14 or 20 years after,
Yeah.
they brought the third graders. I was wondering whether this kind of thing would be possible with your program. Maybe 20, 15 years after,
Talk
to
to
bring
them.
these people back and let them talk about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think if we did, and even when we did the focus group, we had a sense that individuals felt very much that their lives had changed. They were talking, like this woman, Christy, they were talking to their children differently, they were interacting in their communities differently. A few people started businesses around this, addressing children. They wanted us to go into high schools and do work. So it's there, it's just 5 years is not enough, you know, in some ways. But I also think that 5 years was right for that, and there's pieces of it that live, but now we can actually maybe begin to have a more direct conversation because there's some more people with resource to do that work.
Do you think that other universities should adapt the community dialogue, or do you think that there needs to be a sort of catalyst like there was at Emory?
I hope that people don't have to go through here like that. I mean, my ultimate goal with this was that we wouldn't always be reactive, that we would actually try to be proactive. And so part of this idea that there's work to do, there's always this work to do. It's not like I needed an anthropology professor to stand up and say that to get a ball rolling, although it did, that's what happened in that case. And so there are other institutions, UVA, Clemson, College of Charleston. We had University of California, Irvine, which they've had a lot of issues around anti-Muslim bias there, who are interested in using this particular kind of thing, really investigating the history and using it to have these community dialogues. The other thing I would say, and I was always very clear with people, like this is one program. And if, you know, even at Emory, you know, not even at Emory, anywhere, you probably need a bunch of different things. Like this history doesn't appeal to, it doesn't connect the dots for everyone. And so it works for the people it worked for, and it continues to work for those people, but there are other ways that these need to be addressed, and some of those are head-on ways. So we had the community dialogues in this program in a moment when our Equal Opportunity Programs office was broken, and a lot of people didn't have any trust in it, and we didn't have an Office of Community and Diversity and all these things. So now that those institutions are kind of back on their feet, they've taken a few things from us, they're moving the ball down the field now, and we're doing some other things. So I think it's really particular to your institution, and then recognizing it's not going to be the only thing that's going to work.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What you mentioned that you had dinners and dinner conversations.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of food do you serve to people who are talking about diversity?
All the best kinds. So the first year, I had my favorite restaurant cater it, and they did a deal for us. My favorite restaurant at the time. Then they kind of lost the mark. When my co-director, Jody Usher, who you heard Kenny Hong talk about, who's a wonderful woman, but she's not as into food as I am. So she went through Emory Catering and got these little sandwiches that were, so we cut our catering, well, we actually didn't cut our catering budget. It was a bureaucratic thing, it was easier. It was enough, you know. We did these over breakfast, lunch, or dinner. We tried afternoon snack, but the time didn't work, I think, with commuting and kids and things like that. And it was usually just enough to get people to the meeting, and particularly for lunch, you know, it meant they didn't have to pack a lunch that day. But it wasn't enough if the dialogue group wasn't going well, you know. If people, you know, you order 12 lunches and 2 people show up because people aren't happy in their group, then nothing can save it. So you could have the best food in the world, no one would show up if they were upset. So.
Going back to the point before, if there's no negative catalyst, how do you convince an institution that it has a problem? Wouldn't the fallback position just be, hey, we're not Emory, we don't have this stuff.
We don't have that stuff going on.
Great one.
Yeah, that's true. It is. It's a great question. This is a good, okay. This is, yeah, absolutely. So when we invited those 25 schools to Emory, we asked them for their diversity figures. And I looked at them, and so they're all similar, you know, we had public schools, we had small private schools, small liberal arts colleges, a couple of Ivies, whatever. You looked at the numbers among just the student body. They couldn't give us faculty numbers a lot or staff numbers a lot of time. They're all within the same margins. They're pegging to each other. They're not pegging to a higher standard. They're not pegging to some greater sense of who they are. They're just trying to make sure that they don't get beat out by somebody or, you know. And so, again, the question becomes, is that all it's about? So people in an institution need to I think, you know, you have to get a kind of either critical mass or someone who has to hear someone important to raise it to importance and to think about it beyond just a numbers game, you know. I mean, to me, that seeing those figures was very revealing. I was like, this is, you know, they're all in this, you know, U.S. News and World Report kind of race. And there are definitely people speaking out against that. But that's really constraining our creativity and not just on race issues. So, you know, people need to really start talking about some of those kinds of things. Some of it is not, so that's one thing, and that's at that level. But the other thing is that in terms of how we think about students, how we think about admissions, there's a whole other range of ways, even our curricular, you know, things that still need to be talked about. And there are things that can happen because, you know, that happen because I talked to the president or provost, but they're not on the ground in Emory College every day. And who's going to, you know, make that happen? Faculty, students, beating up their deans sometimes. But that, you know, that just has to be part of the will of the people in that institution. You can have an exceptional dean or an exceptional administrator who's set the mark. And sometimes it's critical to actually get a change to happen. But, you know, there's a lot that we could be doing better. And it's just going to take people who really want to get it done. I'm part of a group of women. There's some, I don't know the song reference, but it's, we sometimes refer to ourselves as people who do we're going to do just a few small repairs. I can't remember the artist who sings this song, but it's that kind of, we're just going to try this little thing and see what happens. And sometimes it's just a little thing that keeps going. Other times you get to do something